She stood in the center of the courtroom, red-faced and shaking with rage, her voice echoing off the polished marble walls. She should be locked away for life, or worse. People like that don't belong in our neighborhood. Her finger was pointed straight at my daughter, who sat quietly in her wheelchair, eyes wide but unafraid. The room fell into a stunned silence as the word sank in. Gasps, murmurs, even the stenographer paused for a second. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, had just demanded the death penalty for a child with a disability. She had no idea who I was. No idea that I wasn't just some grieving father. No idea that I had heard every lie she told, every forged complaint, every whispered insult dressed up as community concern. Because for weeks, I had let her build her case, gather her twisted army of HOA supporters, and push this madness forward under the illusion of authority. I had watched from the shadows, waiting for the moment she would cross the one line she could never return from. And today was that moment. You could see it in her eyes. The arrogance, the entitlement, the absolute certainty that the law would bend to her will. But she didn't recognize me yet. Not in this setting. Not in this seat. Not in this robe. She thought I was just another name on a file. She had no idea that the very man she was trying to manipulate was the federal judge assigned to her case. And what happened next? Well, that's where everything she thought she controlled came crashing down. But to understand how we got here, how this war between a mother, her daughter, and a monster in pearls began, you need to go back to the beginning. Before everything spiraled into legal warfare and public outrage, life was quiet, beautiful even. I had moved into the neighborhood nearly 5 years ago after my wife passed away. Just me and my daughter, Ellie. She was 8 at the time, a small girl with a bright mind and a fragile body, born with a rare neuromuscular condition that confined her to a wheelchair. But what she lacked in mobility, she made up for in spirit. Ellie was sunshine in motion, or rather in stillness. She'd laugh at my worst jokes, paint the sky in her notebooks, and wave at every neighbor from our porch like they were old friends. We had built a little sanctuary together. Our home wasn't grand, but it was filled with love, warm wood floors, wind chimes that sang in the breeze, and a carefully built ramp out front so Ellie could come and go freely. I chose this neighborhood because it promised peace and security, a gated suburb with smiling families, clean sidewalks, and a seemingly harmless homeowners association that promised to preserve community values. At first, the HOA felt like a formality. They sent welcome letters, hosted holiday potlucks, and passed around newsletters filled with landscaping tips and pet regulations. It all seemed so benign. We'd get friendly nods on walks. Ellie was gifted sidewalk chalk by the lady across the street, and on most mornings, the neighborhood felt like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. People smiled, lawns were trimmed, children played on driveways, and for a while, I believed I had made the right choice, that this was the place where Ellie could live freely without judgment. But as her presence grew more visible, as her needs required small accommodations like an extended ramp or our caregiver parking in the driveway, the smiles started to falter. Little things, subtle things, a side glance here, a sigh there. Nothing I could call out directly. Not yet, but it was enough to unsettle something in my gut. And among all the polished smiles, one neighbor stood out, the one who never waved back. The one who looked at my daughter not with kindness, but calculation. Her name was Karen. And soon, she would become a storm we never saw coming. It began quietly. So quietly that at first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. A note taped to my mailbox and signed, written in blocky capital letters, "Please remove the wheelchair ramp. It's not aesthetically pleasing and violates HOA exterior uniformity." At first, I laughed. Surely it was a mistake. No one in their right mind would complain about a medical necessity. But when I brought it up at the next HOA meeting, no one acknowledged it. They just smiled that tight, suburban smile, the kind that says we know, but we won't say. A few days later, I got my first violation notice, improper waste disposal. Apparently, our trash bins had been left on the curb too long, even though I'd wheeled them out and back within the same window as everyone else. I brushed it off, assumed it was automated, but then came the landscaping warning. Unapproved vegetation, they called it. It was a small flower bed Ellie had helped plant lavender and sunflowers, her favorites. The HOA said it clashed with the neighborhood palette. It was absurd, but again, I complied. I didn't want conflict. I just wanted peace. But the notices kept coming. One day, a complaint about nuisance sounds, Ellie's speech therapy sessions. Another about excessive visitor parking because her caregiver parked out front. I started to feel watched, observed, judged. Karen began appearing more often. She didn't speak to us directly, just stared. She'd walk her dog past our house 3 times a day, always lingering a bit too long near the ramp, always pretending not to look, but always looking. Once, I caught her taking a picture of our porch. When I asked her if there was an issue, she smiled thinly and said, "Just making sure everything's up to code." It was in that moment I realized she wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was documenting, building a case. I found my trash can tipped over one morning, medical supply packages scattered across the lawn like confetti. No one saw anything, of course. Another time, our mail went missing, only to mysteriously return a week later unopened inside the HOA newsletter. It was also calculated, so veiled in plausible deniability. Nothing ever loud, nothing ever direct, just an escalating pattern of small, intentional acts designed to provoke without consequence. I started to document everything, every notice, every whisper, every encounter, because something told me deep in my bones that this wasn't just about rules or appearances. This was about control, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she had it all. What started as veiled annoyance quickly turned into targeted harassment. Karen was no longer hiding behind anonymous notes or passive-aggressive complaints. She was escalating boldly and relentlessly. It began with a formal letter from the HOA demanding the removal of Ellie's medical lift on the back porch, citing it as an unauthorized structural modification. Never mind that the lift was approved by the city and essential for her safety. Karen, as the self-appointed voice of the community, claimed it diminished the neighborhood's property values and made the area look institutional. Her words, cold, clinical, dripping with superiority, struck a nerve I didn't even know I had. Then came the petition. Yes, an actual petition. She went door to door with that same smug smile, asking neighbors to sign a request to restrict non-conforming medical installations in visible areas. Some neighbors, caught off guard or misinformed, signed. Others avoided confrontation by pretending not to be home. A few brave ones warned me, quietly slipping screenshots of the group chat Karen had created Protect Our Neighborhood, it was called, where she referred to Ellie's presence as a public disturbance and labeled our home a health hazard. One message read, "If we allow one family to clutter our streets with hospital equipment, what's next? Oxygen tanks on the sidewalks? Stretchers in driveways?" I couldn't believe what I was reading. These weren't just comments. They were attacks on my daughter's right to exist freely in her own home. Karen even filed a noise complaint about the beeping from Ellie's heart monitor, something you'd only hear if you were standing directly outside her window at night, which I realized one evening Karen had been. I caught her there, phone in hand, recording audio. She didn't even flinch when I opened the door. "Just checking on a community concern," she said with a wicked grin. I slammed the door shut before I said something I'd regret. But inside, I was burning. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was helpless. I had played by the rules. I'd followed every HOA regulation, submitted every form, paid every fine, and responded to every complaint with patience and professionalism. But this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about punishment, about power. Karen had turned the HOA into her personal army, and she wielded the rulebook like a sword. I started to lose sleep. Ellie began to sense the tension. She stopped going outside, stopped waving at neighbors. The light in her eyes dimmed a little more each day, and that more than anything destroyed me. Not the fines, not the lies, but the way it slowly chipped away at her joy. I wanted to protect her, to shield her from the cruelty of people like Karen, but no matter how hard I tried, the walls were closing in. I felt cornered in my own home. The place that was supposed to be our haven had become a battleground. And through it all, Karen stood tall, confident, untouchable. Or so she thought. Because while she believed she was winning, what she didn't know was that I had started preparing my own case, one she would never see coming. I never imagined she'd go that far. There's a line, an invisible boundary, that even the most bitter neighbors instinctively know not to cross. But Karen didn't hesitate. One Tuesday afternoon, just as Ellie was finishing her online tutoring session and I was brewing tea in the kitchen, there was a knock at the door. Not firm, not friendly. Official. I opened it to find two Child Protective Services workers standing stiffly on our porch, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning our home before a word was said. We've received a report regarding medical neglect and unsafe living conditions involving your daughter, one of them said. My world froze. Ellie peeked from behind the hallway, confused. I ushered her back, gently, heart racing. As they stepped inside, I knew instantly who had done it. Karen. She had crossed that sacred line and called the state on me, a single father doing everything in his power to keep his daughter alive, loved, and safe. The CPS agents moved through our house, room by room, as if they were searching for hidden horrors. They examined Ellie's room, her medicine drawers, her bathroom railings. One of them even took a picture of the monitor beeping beside her bed. Ellie sat in silence, her tiny hands folded in her lap, watching strangers comb through the intimate pieces of her life like it was a crime scene. She didn't speak, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what was happening. She wasn't just a kid anymore. She understood cruelty. She had felt it in whispers, in stares, and now in state-sponsored suspicion. When they asked her, "Do you feel safe at home?" she looked straight at them and replied, "I feel safe until the doorbell rings." That broke me. After the inspection, they told me they saw no signs of neglect, that everything appeared well managed, and they would close the case. But the damage had already been done. The humiliation of being treated like a suspect in your own home, of seeing your daughter's dignity stripped away by a lie, it leaves a scar deeper than any fine or citation. That night, Ellie didn't ask for her storybook. She didn't ask to paint or play. She just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. And I sat beside her, staring at the walls of a house that no longer felt like ours. That night, I stopped being polite. I stopped responding with courtesy and patience. I stopped hoping Karen would come to her senses. Something hardened in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a protector. And protectors don't beg for peace, they prepare for war. Karen had made a move meant to destroy us. What she didn't realize was that in doing so, she awakened a version of me I kept buried behind courtrooms and legal decorum. She wanted a fight. So I decided I would give her one, but by the book with the truth and with the full force of the law. And I had more power than she could possibly imagine. The cruelty didn't end with the CPS ambush. It was just the beginning of Karen's public campaign to turn the entire neighborhood against us. Not content with whispers and paperwork, she decided to put her hatred on full display. It started with a notice slipped into everyone's mailbox, an unsanctioned community safety bulletin, clearly authored by Karen, though nowhere did it bear her name. The tone was masked in faux concern, but the message was unmistakable. Residents are advised to be aware of recent disturbances and concerning medical activity originating from Lot 27. That was our address. It went on to reference unauthorized caretakers' suspicious vehicle activity and the distressing sounds of machines at all hours. She never mentioned Ellie by name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. The air around us shifted. Neighbors who once smiled now avoided eye contact. The boy across the street, who used to ride his bike with Ellie nearby, suddenly wasn't allowed outside when we were. I heard murmurs during morning walks, saw curtains shift as we passed, felt the walls of invisible judgment closing in. And then came the meeting. The monthly HOA gathering, which I typically skipped, suddenly included a neighborhood safety discussion on the agenda. I decided to attend. I wish I hadn't. Karen stood in front of a crowd of 30 or so residents in the community hall and began her speech. "This isn't about discrimination," she said, her tone dripping with false civility. "It's about safety, about maintaining the standards of our neighborhood. We have to ask, is it fair that one family's choices affect all of us?" Then, in front of everyone, she mentioned the CPS visit. "They came for a reason," she hinted. "That should be enough for concern." Gasps, side glances. No one looked at me. Ellie wasn't there, thank God. I sat silently in the back, my fists clenched under the table. When I finally stood to speak, Karen cut me off. "You've had your say plenty of times, sir. Maybe it's time you think about what's best for everyone, not just your own interests." Applause followed. Applause. That night, I came home to find red spray, paint smeared across our garage door. One word: Burton. The flower bed Ellie had planted was stomped to dirt. A window shattered. The silence afterward was the worst part. No one came to ask if we were okay. No one said a word. It was as if we had become ghosts in our own neighborhood, and Karen was the priestess performing the exorcism. Ellie didn't cry. She looked at the broken window and simply said, "They don't want me here." I had no words for her. I didn't want to lie. The truth was they didn't. Or, at least, they had been manipulated into believing they didn't. That was Karen's true talent, not just cruelty, but persuasion. She cloaked her malice in neighborly concern, wrapped it in the language of standards and safety, and weaponized the silence of others as validation. But what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I wasn't leaving. Not for her. Not for anyone. This wasn't just about a ramp or noise or property values anymore. This was about my daughter's right to exist, to be seen, to be safe. And I was done playing the role of the quiet parent, the compliant resident, the good neighbor. They wanted a spectacle. I would give them justice instead. It was a quiet Thursday morning when I received the envelope hand-delivered, thick, stamped with official court markings. At first, I thought it might be another HOA violation notice, maybe a fine dressed in fancier paper. But as I unfolded the contents, my breath caught. It was a formal lawsuit. Karen had filed an actual civil complaint against me, not just as a neighbor, but as a parent. Her claims were outrageous on their face. That my daughter's medical equipment created environmental hazards, that our home's modifications for accessibility constituted unapproved structural dangers, and most horrifyingly, that Ellie herself posed a threat to the safety and well-being of all surrounding residents. She called my little girl, my fragile, beautiful wheelchair-bound daughter, a danger. I read the words 3 times, thinking I must have misunderstood, but it got worse. In the appendix, buried in her lawyer's venomous language, was the most unthinkable demand. Karen was petitioning the court for the legal removal of Ellie from a neighborhood and included a reference to state-supported protective action, citing a decades-old, long-repealed statute that once allowed forced institutionalization of disabled persons under the guise of community protection. But the line that hit me like a truck was this: in the most extreme and justified interpretation of the law, and should the court find intent to endanger through prolonged negligence, such behavior may be construed as criminal endangerment of others, potentially warranting capital review. Capital review. She was using carefully chosen legal phrasing to imply that Ellie's presence could justify the death penalty. My hands trembled as I folded the papers back into the envelope. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat in silence, staring at the pages like they were written in fire. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. She had weaponized the law in the most grotesque way possible, trying to twist justice to serve her prejudice. I contacted a colleague at the courthouse and confirmed the case had been filed with the district court. The date was set. The wheels were turning. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while I had kept my personal life and my profession separate for years, the mask was about to come off. She thought she was dragging me and my daughter into a legal nightmare. She thought she would force us out, humiliate us, destroy us. But she didn't know who she was really dealing with. I had been silent for months, watching her play checkers while I laid out the chessboard. I knew every move she'd made, every false report she filed, every signature she forged, every neighbor she manipulated. And I knew the law, better than she ever could. Because the courtroom she had just walked into, the one where she expected to be heard, validated, obeyed, it belonged to me. The day she stepped into court demanding justice for a crime that never existed, she would be standing face to face with the very person she tried to ruin. She just didn't know it yet. The day of the hearing arrived with an eerie calm, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. The courtroom was bright, cold, clinical, exactly the kind of place Karen believed she could manipulate with charm and pretended righteousness. She strutted in wearing a pale blue blazer, hair sprayed into immobility, clutching a thick binder of printed complaints like a sword forged from entitlement. Her attorney, a local civil litigation rookie, likely pulled in for cheap, followed behind her, flipping through the case file with self-importance. I watched from behind the privacy screen in my chambers, observing her as she smiled smugly at the bailiff, nodded condescendingly at the clerk, and took her place at the plaintiff's table like she owned the building. She didn't see me. Not yet. Not in this context. And I let her bask in the illusion for one final moment. The court assistant walked through the door and announced, "All rise." The honorable judge presiding. The room stood as it always does, and I stepped forward, robed, gavel in hand, expression unreadable. Karen didn't even look up at first, but when she did, when her eyes finally landed on me behind the bench, the color drained from her face like ink spilled into water. It was as if time itself stopped. Her jaw tightened. Her mouth parted slightly as if trying to form words, but finding none. The same woman who had declared my daughter unfit to live in our own home now stood paralyzed by the reality that the very system she tried to weaponize was being held in the hands of the man she had tormented for nearly a year. I could feel the silence in the room shift. Her attorney leaned over and whispered, "Do you know the judge?" Her hand twitched. She whispered something back. I didn't hear it. I didn't need to. I let the moment stretch just long enough for the gravity to sink in. And then, with deliberate calm, I spoke, "Due to a clear conflict of interest, I will be recusing myself from presiding over this hearing. A new judge has already been assigned and will arrive shortly. In the meantime, this court will recess." I struck the gavel. The sound cracked like thunder across the room. Karen stood frozen as I rose from the bench, removed my robe, and walked past her. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Her entire face collapsed into itself. Not rage, not defiance, just dawning realization. She hadn't filed a complaint against a nameless neighbor. She had filed a complaint against a federal judge, and worse, she had committed perjury, harassment, and defamation, all documented, all legally retrievable. Every false CPS claim, every forged HOA signature, every threatening message she left under anonymous names. I had it all. As I stepped through the hallway toward the exit, a junior clerk caught up to me and said softly, "Sir, did she really file for the death penalty?" I nodded. She tried. His face went pale. "What happens now?" he asked. I glanced back toward the courtroom doors and said, Now the law meets the truth. And it's her turn to be judged." Because in her arrogance, Karen had stepped into a game she thought she controlled. But the game was mine. And justice, real justice, was just beginning. Once I recused myself from the bench, the legal gears began to turn. Only this time, not against me or my daughter, but against Karen, the newly assigned judge, an old colleague of mine with little patience for theatrics, and even less for injustice, wasted no time in dissecting the case. Within days, my legal team, independent of my judicial role, filed a counterclaim supported by an airtight folder of evidence: falsified HOA complaints, fabricated noise violation logs, anonymous letters traced back to her home computer, and recordings of Karen making ableist remarks during public meetings. But the most damning piece came directly from CPS. A statement declaring that the original complaint was unfounded, maliciously exaggerated, and in violation of ethical reporting standards. That alone was enough to trigger a formal investigation into Karen's actions. HOA board members, once so willing to nod along to her crusade, began to distance themselves. A vote was called. She was removed from the board, unanimously, no defenders, no final speech. Just a stunned, silent walk out of the community hall where she once ruled like a queen. The neighborhood, sensing the shift in power, turned on her with quiet speed. The woman who once led the charge to exile my daughter now found herself ignored in grocery store aisles, uninvited from events, her manicured smile met with tight-lipped nods or flat rejection. Her property, once pristine, began to wither. No more help from neighbors, no more HOA favors. Word spread. Local papers ran a headline: HOA chairwoman accused of targeting disabled child. Judge speaks out after recusal. The irony was too rich. I gave no interviews. I made no public statements. I didn't need to. The truth had done what my voice could never do. It exposed her. Ellie, slowly but noticeably, began to return to herself. She painted again. She laughed at breakfast. She asked to plant new sunflowers in the front yard. And this time, no one complained. We even received anonymous gifts, flowers, apology notes, cards slipped into our mailbox with words like sorry and you didn't deserve this. I never sought revenge. I sought peace. But peace sometimes only comes after the storm. Karen vanished from the neighborhood soon after. Her house quietly sold, her departure unannounced. There was no goodbye, just silence, the kind that follows a verdict, the kind that comes after justice has spoken. And for the first time in months, when Ellie looked up at me from her wheelchair and asked, "Are we safe now?" I smiled and said, "Yes, we are." They say power reveals who we really are. Some chase it to control, to punish, to feel important in a world where they've never truly mattered. Others, like Karen, wield it like a weapon, dressing cruelty up as order, disguising prejudice as policy. But real power isn't about domination. It's about restraint, about knowing you could destroy someone, but choosing instead to let truth speak louder. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight back with fire. I just had to hold the line for my daughter, for myself, and for every parent who's ever been made to feel like protecting their child was somehow a violation of someone else's comfort. Through everything, the notes, the fines, the vandalism, the lawsuit, Ellie never lost her light. She didn't understand why the world could be so cruel, but she understood love. She felt it in our home, in our quiet breakfasts, in the way I brushed her hair and whispered prayers into her blankets at night. That's where our strength came from, not from anger, but from endurance, from the refusal to let someone else define our worth. Karen tried to judge my daughter's right to live freely, to breathe, to exist without shame. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know the man she was targeting wore the very robe she would one day stand before. She didn't know that the gavel she feared would be held by the hand she tried to silence. In her thirst to condemn, she exposed her own guilt, and in trying to write the end of our story, she only guaranteed her own. She wanted to judge my child, but in the end, it was me who judged her fate. If this story made your blood boil, if you held your breath until the truth was finally revealed, don't leave without taking a stand. White heavy checkmark like this video to show you stand against entitled hate and for families who fight back with dignity. White heavy checkmark subscribe to HOA Karen's shorts for more jaw-dropping, real-life justice stories where the entitled get exactly what they deserve. White heavy checkmark share this video with someone who believes in karma, truth, and courtroom redemption. Here on HOA Karen's shorts, we expose the drama they tried to bury and remind the world that sometimes the person they target is the one with all the power.